Hello again, Dan Alasso with History for Today. And this one is going to be a history, and it is going to be a kind of geeky grad student history, perhaps. I said that I was going to go through the notes that I have put into the application Obsidian and talk about things that I thought were very important when I was a grad student. And so this is one of those. This is about Douglass Adair's book, The Intellectual Origins of Jeffersonian Democracy, which is subtitled Republicanism, the Class Struggle, and the Virtuous Farmer. And this was published finally in 2000 by Lexington Books of New York. For the half century before that, it was an unpublished dissertation that Adair completed in 1943 at Yale University. Now, Douglass Adair was an American historian who lived from 1912 to 1968 and is best known for his research on the early republic and specifically on the authorship of disputed numbers of the Federalist Papers. Adair was also apparently a legendary professor who mentored an entire generation of historians. His Yale dissertation was unpublished forever, but the list of borrowers to the original document at the Yale Library is supposedly a who's who of history in the second half of the 20th century, at least in the minds of the borrowers themselves. Many of Adair's grad students seem to have found hints and ideas in it that they were able to pursue in their own studies. Adair begins this study by situating it as a post-Charles Beard analysis of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's political ideas. He asks whether something more should be added to Beard's economic analysis to explain why, although Alexander Hamilton and Madison's economic ideas were practically identical, Madison, the great anti-party philosopher of the Constitutional Convention, went into opposition and helped to organize a highly effective party with Jefferson, supposedly Hamilton's direct antithesis in economic doctrine. In some of that, just now I was actually quoting Adair. The answer, Adair says, is that Jefferson and Madison shared a political outlook informed by the classical traditions that they had both studied, going all the way back to Aristotle. Hamilton was also a student of the classics, Adair says, but his scholarship was much shallower, and he failed to adapt what he had learned in the ancient texts to the conditions of early America. He was much too much of an idealist, Adair suggests. This is an interesting argument, and intuitively it's very satisfying. Elite education in the 18th century was classical, and all three men, as well as John Adams and the rest of the members of the Constitutional Convention, would have shared that education and would have shared a language that came out of it. Adair makes his case that the founders didn't just come up with their political philosophy by watching their neighbors in the Virginia Piedmont, as some Turner-influenced historians have apparently claimed, but the question of specifically how each of the founders was able to adapt this shared classical heritage into their various plans for the American Republic is left largely unanswered. Adair leans heavily on the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, especially on David Hume, as progenitors of the Founding Fathers' worldview. He lists the books that Madison studied under the Scotsman John Witherspoon at Princeton. In addition to Leibniz and Newton and Descartes, Madison read Shaftesbury and John Locke and Hume and Hutcheson and Mandeville and Adam Smith. The inclusion of Smith suggests that the Republicans were not economic illiterates that the supporters of Hamilton made them out to be. Although the Adam Smith that Madison may have read may have been his theory of moral sentiments and not his inquiry on the wealth of nations. Fisher Ames described Madison as, quote, a thorough master of almost every public question that can arise, or he will spare no pains to become so. In a note, Adair mentions that by the early 1850s, the prominence of continental political classics in school curricula was beginning to decrease, resulting in an observed decrease in references to the ancients in political speeches. But all the evidence suggests that Madison and Jefferson and their serious contemporaries arrived on the scene at the peak of classical scholarship. Adair says that Jefferson's most powerful influence was Aristotle, and that the hope that a class of virtuous yeomen could stabilize the republic was lifted directly from Aristotle's politics. He describes Shays' rebellion as a debtor's revolt, echoing an interpretation based on politically motivated contemporary sources, like General Knox's letters to Washington. But Adair says that the ominous event, and he's quoting Madison when he says ominous event, sent the founders rushing back to their shelves for answers in Thucydides and Xenophon and Aristotle. Maybe this was part of the solution, but maybe it also limited the effectiveness of the final solution. The two missing pieces of Adair's puzzle seem to repeatedly be, how did regular people react to all this classically inspired politics, and how accurately did the founders really understand their situation before they fit it into the models written by these philosophical masters 2 millennia earlier. Adair hints at the possibility of over-applying classical analogies, but he ascribes it only to Jefferson and Madison's adversaries. Hamilton is described as brilliant, but with a shallow understanding of the classics. Adams's use of Thucydides' account of the sedition at Corcyra in his defense of the constitutions of the United States is shown to be not only the most tenuous of analogies, but also to miss the point that Shays and his rebels were behaving symbolically rather than trying to take over the state of Massachusetts. Adair argues that because the principals of these debates believed that these analogies were significant, we should reconsider their relationship to the events. This is probably true with respect to John Adams' paranoia, and may be an approach to assessing not only the strengths, as Adair suggests, but the weaknesses of the founders' vision. Gouverneur Morris's posthumous opinion of Alexander Hamilton is quoted at length, and probably contains the seeds of a book or two. It goes like this. Our poor friend Hamilton bestrode his hobby to the great annoyance of his friends, and not without injury to himself. More a theoretic than a practical man, he was not sufficiently convinced that a system may be good in itself and bad in relation to particular circumstances. He knew well that his favorite form, that would be monarchy, was inadmissible, unless as the result of a civil war. And I suspect that his belief in that which he called an approaching crisis arose from a conviction that the kind of government most suitable, in his opinion, to this extensive country could be established in no other way. So apparently Gouverneur Morris thought that Hamilton was hoping for a civil war that would bring about a monarchy. For nearly a generation, American political thinkers had shared Locke's exclusive concern, Adair says, with curbing the powers of kings. But now, in the summer of 1787, the convention delegates were almost unanimously agreed that the people themselves presented an additional problem. And perhaps the delegates' nearly unanimous opinion highlights yet another problem. Ironically, after arguing that Beard ignored politics and ideas, Adair blames Hamilton for economic policies that divided the American people into sharper cleavage than had existed since 1776. The reduction of the Confederacy's problems to Hamilton's national financial schemes, and the reduction of Hamilton to, quote, a victim of his Plutarch and his Tacitus, is the book's greatest weakness, I think. Adair even quotes Woodrow Wilson, who said Hamilton was a great man, but not a great American. To which a previous reader of the book, who had gotten there ahead of me, had written in the margin, tosh, which I found amusing. Adair says that Hamilton's reductive mistake was his assumption of class struggle, that ultimately, quote, faction would pivot entirely upon the conflict of haves and have-nots. Madison, Adair says, saw past this Hobbesian error after a long review of the classics and challenged the basic postulate upon which the ancient mixed government depended for its justification. And in so doing, he exploded the justification for a permanent will in the community to keep the immutable strife of the few and the many within bounds. But he never really says what those other elements of factionalism were, or how Madison proposed to keep them in check or play one against the other to stabilize his system. And this is where a look back at Frederick Jackson Turner, whom Adair threw out in the preface, might be helpful. Both Jefferson and Madison had experienced the frontier, and when the Louisiana Purchase was completed, Madison breathed a sigh of relief and added a generation onto his expectation for America's survival. But Madison did the math and decided that by 1930, Americans would necessarily be reduced by a competition for employment to wages which afford them the bare necessities of life. The proportion being without property cannot be expected to sympathize sufficiently to its, property's, right to be safe depositories of power over them. It would be impossible, he concludes, to base a Republican government on a minority without creating a standing military force, dangerous to all parties and to liberty itself. Madison's classics apparently held no answer, really, and he simply hoped that when the time came, the wisdom of the wisest patriots in a future generation would pull them through, or at least that's what he said in his Notes on Suffrage, which he wrote during the Virginia Convention of 1829 and 1830. So there's a lot to unpack there. I'm fascinated by Adair's insistence on the centrality of these ancient classics to the founding generation, but it doesn't strike me that they got a lot of useful and conclusive answers from these classics. However, as I said, Adair's work in 1943 opened the floodgates of additional research by his students throughout the next several decades, and so it does stand as a huge contribution to the historiography. So I hope people found that at least a little bit interesting. So thanks for listening. I'll see you again next time.